We speak our words, we listen.
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 I'm really happy to be speaking to you again, Jim. It's a little while since we last spoke, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, since we last had a conversation. You were very involved in a Colicon, a completely online conference to which you turned up in person. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can explain that. Well, I'm sure I can. I was invited over in 2007, and since then I've gone over annually, arranging it all for myself and seeing it as a place where I can get in the head zone. I just took it upon myself to go. It continued to strike me as a strange thing to do until I arrived there, and for 4 wonderful days I sat, listened and read and attended as many presentations as I could in the way that I could have done at home. But I just think being there and the whole community of O'Cally, it had become an annual reset, for 1 week in the year. I would do nothing other than listen and learn.
It's really interesting to get to know that about you, Jim. It's this immersion thing that you do.
It's the opportunity, the session that you did, that you presented. I encouraged them to make contact with you afterwards. Being there, it is that immersion thing where, I don't have to think about what I'm having for dinner or do those dishes or go to that meeting tomorrow morning. I can just really, it's basically listen and learn.
I think you missed out on the opportunity of a nice compliment.
I'm not, listen, I'll do anything with you, but I refuse to accept compliments.
I think you interrupted me and stopped me saying, it's this immersion thing that you do, Jim, that I've heard from you before. It's this want, need, interest, passion of you to immerse yourself and involve yourself in autism. And I see it in what you've just described going to a Calicon, and I've also seen it when you're trying to find a different way of communicating with autistic people in your work, especially the work that through people who are in contact with the prison service and justice system. So that's the compliment I wanted to pass on to you, that it's recognised that there's a difference in you as a professional.
I appreciate that, Julian, and I do thank you for that.
You're living a life and you're living a career. You're not going to a separate job of work, are you?
I've never seen it as a career, never at all, but I suppose it has been.
This is an Autistic Association production for autisticradio.com. We have been making different programs exploring the idea of autistic people having a seat at the table. Amongst us, we've already made 4 separate podcasts with our own thoughts on this and looking at the concept from different angles as a group, as an autistic group. The first conversation I wanted to have, when we as a group actually decided that we wanted to involve professionals in this conversation and hear what they want to add to, was I wanted to know what Jim thought. Jim has worked with us before on different occasions, and some of you will have heard his podcast and know that he has a very long career in autism. He also has a closeness to an empathy with autistic people that you don't see everywhere. Hi, Jim. I'm really glad we're having this conversation. Can I ask you first of all to just take the phrase "a seat at the table" for autistic people, and tell me where you start with that?
It's a really interesting one, and since we arranged this, I've been thinking about it a lot, and as always, I end up getting involved in the language and the words that are being used. I remember as a very young head teacher in a school and I still do this, trying to convince people in schools and in workplaces that we do things with the individual and not to the individual. I found that quite a useful tool to speak to staff about, and still speaking to a parent last week, do things with your son, don't do things to your son. I think the issue about a seat around the table is completely and totally inarguable. But I ask myself, why is it not happening more? And I wonder if it's because we haven't actually answered or asked the basic questions of which table are we talking about and who is it that's going to be sitting around the table. I'm minded of a meeting I was in London where a member around the table said that there were not enough autistic people around the table for that particular meeting. And my immediate thought was, well, how do you know? Because I knew that there were at least two people sitting to my left who had a diagnosis of autism, but had elected not to disclose it at that particular time. Are we talking about autistic people, or are we talking about people who are self-identified as, or are we talking about people who are autistic but who really have never had the formal diagnosis? There is a discussion to be had about the terms that we're using to begin with.
Well, I'd like to simplify that. I would just like to say that we as a group, we work with people who self-identify, people who have a diagnosis, don't have a diagnosis. It's as long as somebody has an actual relationship to autism that they can feel and that other people can recognize in them, I think we just have to take people at their word.
Yeah, I would shout that from the rooftops, Julian. My issue is when I've spoken to organisations who've asked me to do something, I was asked to develop some training on neurodiversity. The first thing I wanted to do was talk about this very fact, who has a diagnosis and who doesn't, and doesn't matter. And the organisation I was working with, it didn't want that mentioned at all. You will get round the table if you have a diagnosis. And that happens in HR departments. Many adults will contact me and say, Jim, I think I need to go for a diagnosis. And I say, why? And I'm given lots of reasons. And the reason they've decided to go for a diagnosis is the boss has said, oh, that's all well and good, but I'm making no adaptations. I'm not giving you any further understanding unless you can prove to me a formal diagnosis. So I agree with what you've just said. But out there...
I had no idea that we were going to go there.
Yeah, that's illegal.
Yeah, it absolutely is, Liz.
That is illegal. The wording of the Equality Act, you do not need a diagnosis, you do not need to provide any paperwork. You may have to provide medical evidence that not having the accommodation is causing you a problem, but a doctor's note will do that. You don't need to provide diagnosis paperwork. I mean, I'm pissed off, but I'm not shocked. I'm not surprised. I'm just, yeah.
I think that's a wonderful interjection.
What I'm trying to illustrate is that even now, in 2024, that story, or stories like it, even in schools working with young children, we are not changing our way of working with this 4-year-old because they don't have a formal diagnosis. That is still common. And it's why I get myself into arguments with people. It is illegal in certain situations. It's dumb in most situations, but it's prevalent. And what I'm saying is that the question about, I was questioned by an autistic person why I was round the table at a particular time, and that person didn't know whether I have a diagnosis or not. So, what I'm trying to work through in my own head is that this argument about a seat around the table, the argument was won 20 years ago, but why is it not happening as often as it should? You know from previous conversations that my whole being is designed to, how can we make it irresistible? Because when it happens, and there are wonderful, wonderful examples around the UK of it happening, it benefits everyone and people embrace it and enjoy it. But how we change the culture, how we change people's thinking.
If we say the concept of being at the table is autistic people being heard and being asked their opinion even, and asked for advice or information, is there pushback against that? Do people prefer not to have autistic people at the table?
Yes, in isolated situations, yes. What I'm saying is that it happens. The opposite, where the voice is listened to and the voice is given a platform, is many times better than it was 5-10 years ago. I see things in a very different situation because I'm only ever asked to become involved in situations that are not working, that are falling apart. No one contacts me and says, things are going wonderfully well. Can you come and tell us what it is that's working? So I have a slightly prejudiced and biased viewpoint on it. I was extolling the virtues of two particular schools in Scotland where what they're calling the neurodivergent group or the autistic group or whatever are absolutely central. There's a school in central Scotland where a group of young autistic students have made a video of their place in the school as a culture, the school as a safe place, and every single person going into the school, parent, new staff, new pupils, gets to see this. So it's happening really well. My frustration is that it's not as common as it should be.
I don't think we expected you to bring up the idea of self-identification as a barrier to a seat at the table for somebody who's autistic.
We've talked about it in some of our broadcasts. It's quite worrying that you're excluding a lot of people by doing this, because in recent years it's been generally accepted that self-diagnosis is part of the so-called norm and should be included. People whose children have been diagnosed and then they're beginning to question it themselves. I'm aware of one or two people that are actually doing that, but they're not formally diagnosed. They've read about autism. They believe that some of the behaviours attributed to autism reflects on them. Self-diagnosed people being involved has been campaigned for quite a long time. And it's disappointing that there's still things out there that still exclude this.
There's always a motive to minimise work for themselves, to do these things if they can get away with them. Institutions not under scrutiny the whole time. Isn't it more about leverage to prevent that than about goodwill and awareness trusted to be acted on, but actually cleaning up their act?
I can see why groups who want autistic input, or project groups, research groups, whatever, who want autistic input could say that they need people who are formally diagnosed in order to ensure that they're getting the right input. Possibly faced with scrutiny from the outside, they may need to say, well, we did consult with autistic people and we ensured that those people were all definitely, clinically approved, all those people were clinically diagnosed as autistic. So I can see where the benefit is in terms of ensuring you're getting the input that you're after, and by being able to defend the project and that seat at the table from criticism from outside the project. But none of that negates the fact that it's still exclusionary. And I see what Harry's saying about the safety aspect. I think if you have got a focus group, like an in-person focus group of autistic people, I would want to know that all of those people self-identified as autistic. I think there's very few... people always surprise me. People always appall me. I think there are very few people that would want to spend an afternoon in a focus group full of autistic people if they weren't also autistic. But you still have to be aware that from a safeguarding point of view, that could happen. So I can see that there's a safety thing as well. But as an autistic person, I would be perfectly happy if the other people there are all self-identified as autistic and nobody had a clinical diagnosis. I can see both sides to it, but it is still exclusionary.
I also think, as well as it being exclusionary. I would consider it to be lazy, where people do not accept differences in diversity and whatever. It's sloppy and it's lazy. I'm a little bit taken aback at how this conversation has gone, because what I'm describing is almost a weekly occurrence for me in all manner. I did a seminar this morning, a webinar this morning, and the question was, these are quite good strategies, but how do we use these strategies with young people who may not have a formal diagnosis? So, and that's a very common question, whether that's in nursery or schools right through to sixth form, 6th year. But again, that might be, I'm maybe not the focus group for this, because that might be, when people are contacting me, they're contacting me because there are problems, and the fundamental starting point of the problem is understanding what autism means to that individual, and do we all have a shared and agreed understanding of what that is. And so I'm still meeting parents where one parent sees, understands and acknowledges the diagnosis and finds it very useful, and the other parent using what I would term more derogatory language to describe the young person's so-called behaviour, whatever. But I'm perhaps skewing this conversation through my own weekly, daily experiences.
I think that's the point, though. The point of you being here, Jim, is to skew the conversation so that it more fully expresses your day-to-day experience.
There is an issue, I've seen the comments, picking up on the word lazy. There is an issue in schools and in the workplace still to this day where we want to work to, the middle line.
You have a concern often that the way society works is that people are looking for the middle way.
Yes.
And that the way you look at things, because you have autism embedded in what you want to do, how you want to live, how you want to spend your time, and also autistic people embedded in that. It's difficult for you when you look at people who just have that as part of their career, and they will do a good enough job rather than the best job.
Yeah.
That's a credit to you. That causes an emotional contact with you. The reality is that everybody out there who has some kind of professional association with autism has enough on their plate, and autism has just been added onto their plate in addition to all their other stuff.
One of the frustrating things is that we believe that, this cliche that everyone's an individual. But in schools and in families and in the workplace, that can be a real challenge. It's a challenge that a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, a lot of employers will pick up on and see benefits from. They will know that a good team is a diverse team, and they will embrace that. I used the word lazy earlier because there are some situations where having to differentiate in class, having to differentiate in a family, having to differentiate in a workplace can be, on the surface, can look time consuming. Where it's done well, and some of these schools and workplaces that I know where they've done it well, it is very productive. It leads to happiness at work, productivity at work, etc., etc. I sometimes think that my job or my task in some situations is to point out that we're not trying to compensate for the young person in our class, but that we can use that person's skills and unique ways of learning to benefit everyone. So I do get frustrated with the fact that we talk about individuality, personalisation, diversity, and we pay lip service to it, perhaps, in some situations.
The word lazy, I can totally relate to that, because you could say that about a lot of things, because individualism complicates what people just want to do as part of routine and a checklist. So they're going, oh, don't complicate it. But they seem to forget that being human is complicated and doesn't fit into what society or general services structure, which try to keep things simple. But that's just the way it is. Not to compensate, but to accommodate different individuals, especially ones in need.
I think the interesting thing for me, the interesting argument to win, or the interesting debate to have, is that if and forgive me for focusing on schools, but it's a good example. Schools now are significantly better at promoting and embracing and celebrating diversity in some forms. I just think that we could add autism, neurodiversity to that.
Is that a seat at the table there, Jim? Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're offering, a seat at the table?
I think that is, yeah. If I was in a nursery 2 or 3 weeks ago and I walked through the front door and I'm greeted with a poster that says hello, good morning in 15 different languages. I'm even greeted with someone on the poster telling me good morning using signing. And it crosses my mind, is the neurodiverse in there? Is the autistic in there? And I think it is seat at the table. It's collaboration. It's working with. It comes right back to that, early thought that I had as a teacher. I need to do this with the children rather than at or to the children. So, I think it's that total inclusion. And inclusion is another word that's been used and misused too. But, total inclusion where everyone has the same opportunities, etc., etc. That to me is what I think we're talking about, is a seat at the table.
How does the table form more than a tick box? How does the seat have levers attached to it and make necessarily a difference against inertia? And actually have leverage to cause a real difference to decisions, to address them.
I think when we look at inclusion in any form, we have to see evidence of things happening that come from that meeting, come from that statement. I hesitate there because I was minded of a school in central Scotland that I was thinking about, where when the group of students talked to me about what changes they wanted to make, I said, can you show me evidence of what did happen? And it was things like they were ensuring that the pupil council also included people from this group. The presentations that they made were also made to parents. So it's about evidence. And as I say, these schools can demonstrate that when it happens, when people are truly included, that they're actually making changes happening. And I think the answer that I want to give is that it's not a tick box if we can demonstrate positive changes that impact on the diverse group of young people or the workforce.
Well, then it doesn't exist in isolation, its own bubble. There's some watching for results.
In most cases, our experience has been that we've been offered what looks like a seat at the table, but then in reality, what turns out doesn't meet what we would foresee as a real seat at the table.
Yeah.
And in this series, we're working out the kinds of things that we would expect to happen if it was genuine, if it wasn't the tick box exercise. And the point you're making there is that you realise and you understand that there is no seat at the table if Jim goes back to a school and when he asks what happened when people were asked for their input, what the results and how did that change things. If without a Jim going in there and looking at it, and our experience is that there is never a Jim going back to whichever organisation that professed to give an opportunity or an advocate space or a seat at the table for decision making, there's no one checking that they actually followed through.
I wonder, I've been thinking a lot about this phrase, a seat at the table, and I'll make two comments. One, I'm not sure whether the seat is what needs to be demanded, because a seat allows you to sit around the table and be ignored. Maybe it's agenda setting around the table or whatever. The other thing that I'm thinking through is the problem partly because of the message that we're giving when we're around the table. I'm not sure still that there's a cohesive message. You know, we want to be around the table, we want to be heard, we want to be listened to. And the question is, well, what is it you have to say? What are you fighting for? What are you asking for? What are you looking for? A number of years ago, in the organisation I was working with, it was announced with great joy that we were given permission on Autism Awareness Week to march towards the Parliament. And my question was, what is it we're going to ask for? You know, wheelchair access to every building, understand that. Votes for women, we understand that. And when I've told this story, I've been given, depending who I'm asking, when I'm asking, and what's context I'm asking, I've been given maybe dozens of different answers to that. So maybe part of the reason that the seat around the table isn't as effective as it should be is that there is not as yet, or I don't know as yet, a cohesive answer, a cohesive message that is unique to autism and neurodiversity and that is consistent. Now, I'm happy to be disabused of that idea, but I just wonder whether it is part of the problem. I spoke to a parent last week who gave me an example of being on the parent council. And, you know, her statement was, I have a number of demands to make. That it wasn't the word demand in that sentence that I was struggling with. It was the fact of, I have a number of. That simplistic way of wheelchair access for all buildings, you know, education for every child, votes for women. I wonder whether if there was a cohesive, consistent message that we could get behind, that the invitation to sit around the table and be listened to might be more.
Adaptations, an umbrella word that probably covers all the issues raised. It's also too abstract to the public who don't know what the adaptations are, but at least it covers everything for those who have some idea about autism.
The difficulty there is that I know of a number of individuals in the workplace who have said very, very clearly the last thing they want is adaptations made for them. And I think that will be heard as well. I'm working with a young man at the moment where the supervisor contacted me and said, what adaptations do we need to make? And I said, have you asked him? And his statement was, I don't want any adaptations. I want to be the same as everybody else. Now, I'm not advocating one or the other here, but that's perhaps what confuses schools. I know schools where young autistic people will say, I want to be exactly the same. I do not want adaptations.
Yeah. But that's within the range of choices. I mean, adaptations where they're needed includes sort of an individual being allowed to decide they're not needed for them, and that could happen in other conditions too, like physical access conditions.
There's no way of knowing when you sit down whether you've got a seat at the table as a genuine seat or whether it's a tick box exercise until after the fact. So it's not until a project lead, an organisation or whatever body is held accountable by somebody asking, well, what happened as a result of you seeking this input from autistic people? What happened as a result of that we know whether it was a seat at the table or not. So it's almost like we have to continue to have faith that all of these things are genuine in order to access the opportunities that are. And we have to just deal with the frustration and disappointment of taking a seat at the table that is a box ticking exercise, because we can't know until after the fact. It's Schrodinger's seat at the table.
That's a nice phrase. We've got limited energy, so we have to make choices. If in any way we as an autistic individuals or in any form of group that we are have any advocacy, then we have to reserve our energy for the places where the opportunity looks most genuine. And we have to say to people who offer a seat at the table what a seat at the table looks like for us.
Yes.
Which is really why we're here. This is the conversation that we're having amongst ourselves as autistic people. And it's a conversation that we're asking professionals to put their words to. I think we need you to come back and speak to us again, Jim, because this is a much bigger subject than we have allowed time for.
It in a way, Julian, it's the only subject. It's, we talk about the progress in our thinking and our learning in the last 30, 40 years. I'm still saddened that this part of the conversation still has to be had. So I'm more than happy to come back and talk again. I feel very welcome, and I feel I'm able to say things I haven't thought through properly, but these are things that are coming at a daily basis. So I'll be more than happy to carry on the conversation at any point.
Well, let me take that wonderful compliment you've just given. Autistic Radio and Spectrum Voices, with the charity Autistic Association, SCIO, creates a safe space for there to be a conversation between autistic people and autism professionals. We want to hear more from you. It could be about the subject of what a meaningful seat at the table looks like for you, or how you offer a meaningful seat at the table if you're an autism professional. But it could also be anything else around the subject of autism. Well, guys, we're all going to get together and we're all going to talk this through again, yeah?
Anytime. Thank you.
That was the first.
Absolutely.
That was the first toe in the ocean. Yeah.
Well, that's the beauty of the podcast that we make. An introduction to somebody with something to say about autism. And that includes you. It's very easy to make a recording with us. We might publish 10 minutes or we might publish 30 minutes. It's about your relationship to autism, whether you're a professional, a carer, or somebody with autism. An autistic person of autistic identity. Contact me, Jules, news@autisticradio.com. And let's make a recording together so that you can join and expand upon the conversation around autism.
We speak, our words, we listen.
We speak. Our words, we listen.
We speak. Our words. We listen.
We speak. Our words, we listen.